In the previous episode, we looked at passing data from parent component to child component using attributes, and in this episode, we'll try to work with something called action handlers. And action handlers comes into picture whenever user wants to click on a button or link, so on and so forth. Now, in this component, which is explore hello world, I'll try to create a button and we'll try to invoke a method or function which is also called as action handler. For that, I'm going to use a new tag altogether, which is called lightning button, and the next attribute is going to be label, and here the label is going to be click me, and followed by that the next attribute is going to be something called on click, and here the value is going to be name of the function, let us say handle click, and before that we need to add something called a value provider once again, which is c dot handle click, which means that we'll be invoking a method or a function which is also called as action handler in something called controller, which is nothing but this. So I'm going to copy this, come back here, and by default it is going to give us this syntax. Now I'm going to replace this with handle click. So this is the name of the action handler, and you can also notice the syntax of the action handler. We have something called component, we have something called event, and we also have something called helper. Now we'll be looking at the purpose of these three things, so on and so forth. Let me go back to the component for a second. If you look at the button that we are trying to create, this is pretty much verbose now, which is we are trying to create a lightning button and the label on it is going to be click me, and once user tries to click on the button, we are trying to invoke this action handler, and since this action handler is in the controller file, we are trying to use a value provider. Back here, this is the name of the action handler and this is the actual function. Now this function will be by default passed three parameters. First one is called component. Now all the information which is related to this component can be accessed by using this parameter, and then if user tries to initiate an event, then all the information related to the event can be grabbed by using this parameter. Likewise, if you want to move some code to the helper file from the controller file, then we'll be making use of this parameter. Now it is not a mandate that this always has to be component, this always has to be event, and this always has to be helper. This can be cmp and this can be evt. For that matter, this can be c, this can be e, and this can be h. Only the order of these parameters matter and the names of the parameters is not going to matter at all. This can be anything. Let me revert it back and then I'm going to save it. And within this action handler, I'll try to have a log statement, and the way I'm going to do it is console.log. I'll try to give this and then end it with a semicolon. I'm going to save it. Let me come back here and save it. Let me come back to the app. I'm going to refresh it. Now this should show us a button. There you go. We have the button. Let me also open up the console panel. When I click on this button, it is going to invoke the action handler and it is going to invoke the debug statement, which is console.log, and it is going to display as the value that we have given within the single quotes, which is this. So successfully, we were able to invoke action handler on click of the button. Now we can also chain action handlers by separating them with commas. And what I mean by that is I can have one more action handler. Let's say handle db click, and followed by that, the function is going to be like this. And once again, I can chain one more action handler to this. And the only thing that I need to be careful about is separate it with a comma and then have one more action handler. Let me remove this. Let me save it. And the next thing is I can move the code from action handler to the helper file. I'll put it here. I'll try to give a name to this and then copy this. Come back to the controller. From here, I'm going to say helper dot click helper. I'm going to save it. So basically what we tried doing is we tried moving the business logic to the helper file. We gave a name to this function, and then back in the controller, we are trying to invoke the method by using the notation which is helper dot name of the actual method. I'm going to save it. Let me come back to the app, refresh it. If everything goes well, then it should work exactly the same way how it used to work earlier. I'm going to click on this. There you go. We're seeing this log message. So all we tried doing is we tried moving the code from our controller to the helper class. And now you would have understood the actual use of this parameter, which is helper. Just because we have this parameter, we can use this notation, which is helper dot, and then the name of the method is going to understand that we are trying to invoke a method in the helper file. And also in the helper file, from one function, we can also invoke one more function. Let's say click helper loop. I'm going to copy this, paste it here. I'm going to remove this. And from here, I'm going to say this dot click helper loop, paste it here. So what we tried doing is we once again moved the business logic from here to a different method altogether, and we are trying to refer this method within this helper method. Now let me come back to the app and let us check if everything is working exactly the same way it is supposed to work. I'm going to click on this. There you go. We see this, which means on click of the button, we are trying to invoke this action handler. And from this action handler, we are trying to move the business logic to the helper file. And from the helper file, we are trying to move the business logic to a different helper method, and we are trying to invoke that method within this helper method. This is how we can invoke a helper method from a different helper method altogether. That's all for this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.